For just $67, you can make as many videos as you want and never need to pick up a camera. Fancy editing software.
And stream.
Drag, you drop, you tweak some settings, and boom, video done. It'll take you just a few minutes. So let's hear from the Doodly creator, Brad.
It's a new day and abundance is here. If you can hear me, let me know. Can you hear me? Let me know if you can hear me. Can you hear me loud and clear? Oops. We're going to get started soon. We're going to get started soon. Okay. muted. It's a new day, guys, and abundance is here. And today is the story therapy session. We probably have to change the time to 3:30 so that I can put myself together and get ready for subsequent sessions. So subsequent sessions would be at 3:30 p.m. CST and 10:30 p.m. West African time. And today we're talking about another type of abuse. So in the last, few weeks, we've been talking extensively about the different types of abuse. We've talked about so when we started this series in the first week of January, the very first thing we talked about was the fact that there are other types of abuse aside from I defined abuse, okay, using the United Nations definition. I kind of set the foundation for this conversation by defining what abuse is and what abuse is not. And then I went on to then talk about some other things from there, which is the different types of abuse there is, and the fact that emotional abuse happens to be the most popular. I mean, the most popular, the most common, but yet the least talked about. And I went on to talk about the different types of places or settings or interpersonal relationships that where abuse takes place. I talked about domestic abuse or abuse within the family setting. I went on to talk about abuse within social network. And today we're talking about religious abuse or abuse within the religious space, right? And so we're talking about abuse within the religious, church setting, religious setting. That is basically what we're going to be looking at today. And so to set the stage for that conversation, I would, kind of, share something that I talked about last week, which is the fact that so there is a way that, abuse can happen in a very indirect way in the sense that someone might be abusive without even acting or looking it. And so a lot of times we need to pay attention to what people say, how they say what they say, and what they do not say, so that we can be, smart enough to know why some people are abusive or the way they are. And you see, when you don't pay attention to what people say or you don't listen or you talk more than you listen, I am a talkative, right? I love to talk, but one skill that I'm developing is I try to listen more. Even though I talk a lot, I try to pay attention to what people are saying and what they are not saying. And that helps me to be able to say, oh, is this where this person is getting to, or is this what this person is trying to do? And this is a skill that we all must develop. And today, not to bore you, I have a story. It's a personal story and it's like a gist. And then I'll go from giving you that gist, that story, and then we'll talk about something else. So the first thing I want to talk about is about one church like that where I used to be a member in this local church. If you come late for workers meeting, there was this pastor that year who, if you come late for workers meeting, would ask you to kneel down or would ask you to do something. Even if you give them reasons why you come late, they begin to say things like they say things like you're taking the work of God for granted. And one thing that I always struggle with is, what exactly is the work of God? I mean, every work that anybody or God has given to everybody, I think is the work of God. Whether you're working in a bank or you're working within the religious space, as long as you're human, you're a child of God, every work you are in is God's work. So church work is not the only form of work that should be categorized as God's work, okay? And that is one point I want you to take away even before we get started or get into, the we'll go deeper into this conversation. Another thing that I think it is very important that we learn is many of us, we speak we so now let's set the foundation. Now I talked about my personal experience, right? that I was in a church where if you come late for workers' meeting, you would be dealt with, or you'll be scolded, and you begin to feel guilty, even if your coming late was not planned. You begin to feel like, maybe God is punishing you, maybe you're not going to make heaven. They begin to weaponize religion. Another example that I can think about from that church where I was a member is that, I recall how, for instance, if you know, if you don't have certain economic privilege, you don't get to be in certain position, or if you don't have certain age, or you're not as old as some people, you don't get to be given positions or opportunities to serve in some of these religious spaces. And you find a situation whereby people marginalize people and kind of use the script of the word of God as their um, as a tool to further cause feel unloved, unaccepted, stigmatize people. And so it is very important that we recognize these things. We know these signs even before they appear. I mean, we should come to that place where you don't just overexalt a man of God or a woman of God and think and believe that everything they say, however they say it, is the way it should be. Now, there's a difference between when the pastor or imam is trying to admonish, and there's a difference between when the person is just being narcissistic, or the person is just being unreasonable, or the person is just trying to weaponize religion. I will give three examples, and then we'll talk about how to avoid this type of interactions, or how to guard and guide yourself. I already told you the story, and then after I talked about the story, I told you what I'm talking about, which is abuse within the religious space. And next, I'm going to talk to you now about the ways in which they do this directly and indirectly. There's the direct and indirect, covert or overt behavior. So the direct approach is they outrightly come at you and say, you that you're wearing this skirt. Now, I'm not saying that you should go to church dressed half naked, or you should not follow the religious norms of the setting or the religious setting you find yourself. But there are instances where a preacher might sound like the person is, he or she is a god. I mean, they could say something like, people who do like this or who talk like this would not make heaven. And so they begin to pass judgment on people. And that causes people to live in fear and panic. And one thing, again, they do successfully is a lot of times they use these lines: God told me, God told me. Even when God did not tell them anything, okay? They say things like, God said to me, God told me, God told me. And so you need to be careful. We need to be careful, because a lot of us, we don't try to have personal relationships with God. We believe what a man of God says or a pastor says, hook, line, and sinker. And the damage or the challenge therein is when you listen to what they say without criticizing, without you first know God for who God is, and don't believe some religious bullshit. I mean, there's so much out there that religious folks are using to confuse people. Now, there's a difference between actually being a faith person and being a religious person. One thing about religion is it is hypocritical, it is narcissistic, because it's all about what people want to see, or how people are seeing us, what we're doing, not what we're doing behind the scene. And so you need to be that kind of person who has a mind of his own or a mind of her own. And when you have a mind of your own, when a pastor or an imam gets to the extreme and begin to sound like God, then you begin to ask yourself if you really want to be in that religious space or not. And one thing they do so well is they intervene in So, for instance, maybe you're in a relationship where, or you want to start dating. A pastor can say, this is the person you should date. You know, I'm your pastor. I know more than you do. Now, there are pastors or men of God who actually know or who are genuine and who care and who are willing to put you on track now. But there are some men of God who don't know what they are saying, but they're actually saying what they're saying just because they want to keep you, under them. So a pastor who comes to you and says something like, Sister Kiniko, I know more than you do. This is the person you should date. This is the brother you should date. You should not date that one. This one is churchy. That one is not churchy, or this one is an imam's son. That one is not an imam's son. You should listen to me. I am the voice of God and I'm your priest. Hello. Some of them could go out to the extent of even cursing you and saying things like, I have cursed you, it won't be well with you. I'm a man of God. And as a man of God, you must listen to me. As a woman of God, you must obey me. That is weaponizing religion. When they say those things, they are making you feel fear. And one thing that abuse is about is to instill fear and panic in the minds of people. One thing that abuse is about is it instills fear and panic in the minds of people. So do not let some religious leaders put fear and panic in your heart and make you think that you're too terrible to get salvation. You're too worse. You're too much of you're too terrible to be saved. You're too stigmatized to ever receive salvation, or you are too evil to ever receive God's grace or God's mercy. Never let any religious leader project their narcissistic tendency on you, because they do that a lot. They're about the drama, the aesthetics. Oh, let people see me perform miracles and wonder. And you need to really be careful. You need to be careful. You don't want to be caught up in a situation whereby you live your life based on what a pastor tells you. You live your life based on what an imam says to you. There are church sisters who will say, if my pastor does not say I should date you, I won't date you. If my pastor does, after some people even get married and they still remain in a certain church because their pastor said they should still be in that church. They don't change church or choose to want to be with their partners. They stay in a church because the pastor says you stay. Oh, you are the pastor's favorites. And you don't want to move on. You don't want to build a family and you only do what your pastor says. You only do what your pastor says. And it's even unfortunate that people who are going through traumatic, experiences in their relationships with their partners, sometimes, they turn to church as a safe zone. You see, church will not save you. Okay? Church will not save you. The only person that can save you is God, and your relationship with God is everything. You don't need a church or that building. Don't make a church your safe zone or your haven. I recall, let me say that, you see, people who have issues in their relationships, who have issues with their partners, should never turn to church activities as a safe zone. A lot of people are workers in church. A lot of people are serving in religious, spaces because they are using that as a coping mechanism. Some people are within religious spaces not because they really love God, but because it's their way of coping. Okay, and so because it's their way of coping, now they are running away from maybe a narcissistic partner or a narcissistic spouse. They find themselves in a space where they have to deal with narcissistic religious leaders. And one thing they do well, like a narcissistic partner would do, is they would put fear in your heart and make you think that, oh, if you don't do this, you will not make heaven. And one thing you need to learn is search the word. If you're a Christian, read the Bible yourself. If you're a Muslim, read the Quran. Okay, whatever you believe in, at least if you know believe in God, try to know God yourself. Try to encounter God yourself. Try to know who God is, not what a pastor says or an imam says or a priest says. You need to know God yourself. Do not let people use religious buraha as, to hold you down. Know God for who God is, and then you'll be free. Now, the last point I want to make today is the ways in which religious leaders intervene in interpersonal relationships, which is like an extension of the point I started making when I was sharing an example on coping mechanism and the ways in which people who don't, who have issues in their marriages or their relationships suddenly turn to church as a safe zone. They become very involved in church activities. And so they get really busy and don't really try to figure out what is going on in their marriage or in their relationship. They don't try to deal with the mess. Okay. So church becomes like my safe space. I have Sister Kemi, Sister Lola, we're in the chill workers, we're in the, choir, we're in the, ushering. So you spend time with these people just to get away from the mess in your life or the mess in your marriage, the mess in your relationship. The truth is, church will not heal you. Now, get it clear. I'm not saying God won't heal you. I said church will not heal you. So when I say church, I'm talking about the activities. I'm talking about the charade. I'm not talking about the faith there. I'm not talking about the encounter with God. I'm talking about the activities that comes with religion and with church. And so my point exactly is church will not heal you if it is about the activity, if it is about worshiping a religious leader or trying to serve the narcissistic needs of one pastor or one imam. You need to know God and walk with God yourself. And so the ways in which these people intervene in relationships or marriages is that they get to the point where, they begin to, they are the ones who make decisions for partners or tell you and say, this is the time you should cook for your husband. Sister Lola, your husband called me and said you don't cook in the morning, or your husband called me and said you don't know how to. Sister Lola, why would you do that? Do you know that God said this? And I'm like, this automatically will take side, or maybe it is even the wife who is the narcissist, and then she calls her pastor and starts to cry, and the pastor is like, your husband did that. I'm not saying that religious leaders or pastors shouldn't intervene in marriages, but it's very important that they are careful, because one, you're not a psychologist. You don't know the personality disorder of that partner whom that person or that lady or brother is married to. And so before, religious leaders turn themselves into marriage counselors or therapists, it is very important that, hey, do they have a license in counseling? Do they know about therapy? Yes, they may have lived experience, right? But lived experience varies from person to person. And so it is very important that you as a person, you have a mind of your own. Get to that point where you can say, see, I know that this pastor or this imam wants the best for me, or you make believe that they want the best for you. But the truth is, you are the one to determine what is the best for you in what situation and at what time. One thing is sure, if you're faithful and you're godly and you walk with God, you can never get it wrong. You will not trust in the voice of a fellow man more than you trust in the voice of God or what your intuition is telling you. And so we need to get to that point where, yes, we believe in church leaders, we trust these religious people, but we are not carried away, or we do not give them so much power that we lose the divinity or the divinity inside of each and every one of us. So my point exactly is, yes, believe in your pastor, in your religious leaders, but they should not control your life. They should not become God, because as a matter of fact, do you fear God as much as you fear those religious leaders? I need you to answer that. So it is very important that you don't focus on them. focus on God, build a relationship with God, and do not use church as a place where you get away from the pain or the trauma in your life. Deal with your problem, deal with your shit, okay? So that you can be whole, you can be hale and hearty. Never use religion as a mask to cover your pain. Okay. And so today I've talked to you about, I did a recap about where we started from this month. I talked about the fact that I reminded you all that we talked about abuse, we talked about the definition, we talked about the different types of abuse there is, and my emphasis on emotional abuse as a major form of abuse. And I also went on to talk about the ways in which narcissistic people or religious leaders who are narcissistic weaponize God. And I also talked about the ways in which, we as believers or maybe as children of God, whether you're Muslim or a Christian, need to be really careful by not using religious spaces as a coping mechanism or as a way of getting away from your trauma. And I also ended by saying that it is very important that you know where to set the boundary so that you do not make a religious leader a God when you do not even have fear for God. So fear God more than you will fear a religious leader. That's my point exactly. And I hope this session has been useful. If you found this really useful, please watch, share, talk to someone about stigma and abuse. Tell people, be that voice that advocates, be that voice that sensitizes, and be that voice, be that change, be that change. Join the conversation, join the campaign against stigma and abuse. Domestic violence is real, and so is intimate partner violence. And emotional abuse is at the center of all this kind of behaviors. And so we need to create more awareness so that people know that emotional abuse is actually worse than any other, is worse than the physical abuse and the most common forms of abuse. And thank you so much for watching. Thank you for listening. And I will see you next week when I will come here to share with you more. And in the coming week, we will talk about, I would wrap up religious abuse, and then I would move on to talk about, I will do a recap of everything we have covered this month. And in the coming month, we're going to talk about something else. And I'll see you next week. Abundance is here. Bye. God bless you. See you.